Great to see everyone, especially all my students. So I'm David Howson. I'm a professor and the Arthur Zankel Director of Arts Administration at Skidmore College. Woohoo! I want to thank you all for coming to what's sure to be an interesting and informative evening. Tonight is a special collaboration with Skidmore and the Hyde collection. So before I begin, I just want to thank some folks at the Hyde, especially Director Charlie Guerin. Where's Charlie? Charlie? Woo! And Debbie Lee, the Director of Development. Debbie? And Alice Grether, the Director of Communication and Visitor Services. Thank you guys for making this all possible tonight. I want to recognize also my fellow Hyde Collection trustees that are in the audience. Thank you for coming. Tonight is a really special night. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Ben Cameron, who I first met when I was a WE graduate student at Yale School of Drama. Since 2006, Ben Cameron has been the program director for the arts at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, supervising a $14 million grants program focusing on organizations and artists in the theater, as well as contemporary dance, jazz, and the presenting fields. In 2012, the foundation announced a special additional allocation to the arts of $50 million for an initiative designed primarily to serve individual artists above and beyond their annual budget. This allocation, which also falls under Ben's supervision, supports 3 separate initiatives, including the Doris Duke Artist Award Program, the Doris Duke Impact Program, and the Doris Duke Building Demand for the Arts Program, which supports partnerships between artists and organizations to build community and audience demand. Students, that's a good partnership, remember that. Previously, Ben served as the Executive Director of Theater Communications Group, Senior Program Officer at the Dayton Hudson Foundation, Manager of Community Relations for Target Stores, and Director of the Theater Program at the National Endowment for the Arts. He has addressed arts gatherings in several foreign countries, as well as throughout the United States, and has served on the national boards of the Arts and Business Council and Grantmakers in the Arts. And he received an honorary degree from Goucher College in Baltimore and DePaul University in Chicago, and an honorary MFA from the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, in addition to earning an MFA from the Yale School of Drama. He continues to teach a special guest seminar at Yale every semester and is currently in his 8th year of service as a member of the Tony Awards nominating committee. This is just a short version of his bio. So after Ben's remarks, we'll have a brief Q&A, and there'll be some students with microphones on the sides. So again, thank you all for coming to a very special night, and please welcome Ben Cameron.
Thank you, everybody, and good evening. Thank you for this opportunity to be back in this area. I was first here to talk to Ann Bogart's board several summers ago. And I've been impressed tonight by what an extraordinary arts-rich community this is. This is really an extraordinary community. I mean, the number of arts organizations, the symphony, the festival devoting new work, et cetera, et cetera. It's an honor to be here. And thank you for giving me your time and your gracious hospitality. You know, in the hour that we have together, whether it's me talking or the Q&A afterwards, I just hope that we will illustrate the path to creativity as defined by Angeles Arian when she says creativity is 4 things. Creativity is that we show up. We really show up. Senses vibrating, humming, taking it all in. We listen deeply. We speak the truth. And we let go of predetermined results. As David mentioned, I work at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, where our late benefactress charged us with focusing on actors, singers, dancers, and musicians. And in order to define what we do, we periodically gather people all over the country, as many as 1,000 such artists, managers, and administrators in multiple meetings to essentially ask, what is keeping you awake at night? In these conversations, which we initiated both in 2006 and then we revisited just a year ago, we hear 3 kinds of issues in arts today. First of all, we hear idiosyncratic issues. Every field has issues it cares about and it alone cares about and nobody else cares about. In dance, for example, dancers, Dancers who typically don't go to college at all, many don't finish high school. Suddenly at the age 32 or 33, their knees begin to go, their backs begin to go out. They are facing the rest of their adult life unable to do the one thing they have been trained to do. Career transition for dancers is an enormous issue in dance. But frankly, it does not resonate in jazz, where jazz musicians play into their 70s, 80s, or 90s, or in theater, where actors can perform into their 60s or 70s, and when they're too old to learn the lines, they go to TV in Downton Abbey. It's true, we know it's true. Secondly, we heard what we call chronic issues. Chronic issues specifically of undercapitalization, as shockingly few American arts groups have significant reserves, much less endowments. The performing arts fields now as a whole operate with aggregate negative working capital, and the majority of arts organizations live on the razor's edge, struggling to meet current obligations. We also talked about undercompensation, not only of artists, but of administrators, managers, and technicians as well. And in fact, when we talk about charitable sectors in the United States, when we talk about corporate philanthropy and private philanthropy and government philanthropy, we all too often fail to articulate the single largest charitable sector of all: the artists, the administrators, and the technicians on whose lives the work is made by virtue of inadequate compensation, lack of retirement benefits, often no health care, and more. Much to our shame, the nonprofit arts in this country are predicated on discounted labor, and we are living the consequences of that legacy now more than ever. When we called these chronic, we didn't mean to suggest that they're not worth addressing or we can't solve them, but rather for people my age, we heard those same issues 10 years ago, we heard them 20 years ago, we heard them 30 years ago and more. But then we heard 4 issues that we didn't hear 10 years ago, or if we did, we didn't hear them as urgently as we hear them today. And these 4 issues are as follows. First of all, rising concern about the growing dysfunctionality of the whole nonprofit industry. Managers especially have said to us, look, I went into this business not because I wanted to run a big business. If that's what I had wanted, I would have gone to Wells Fargo or Target stores or Wall Street. I went into this business because I love the arts. Now my life is about school board policy, it's about donor cultivation, it's about board recruitment. I'm in Albany lobbying Washington, D.C. I go for months or weeks without ever even walking into a rehearsal hall. I see artists come in and out of my building. I don't know who they are. Something is wrong with this system, and isn't there a different way to finance the work we feel called to do? Secondly, we heard about an impending generational transfer of leadership as the current generation of leaders retires or moves on. And I have to say, I want to make perfectly clear that Charlie's departure from the Hyde has nothing to do with my arrival in town. If you had had me yesterday, I would have talked him out of it. So I know that this is a major loss for the community. And Charlie, thank you for hosting us in your facility here at the Hyde tonight. But we heard about this generational transfer of leadership. There was a study from the Myers Report in 2006 that said by 2012, 75% of all nonprofit leaders, including the arts, but not just the arts, would leave their jobs, citing as their top 2 reasons, number 1, they were exhausted from fundraising, and number 2, they were burned out from working with boards of directors. And I'm telling truth here. While this did not happen, in large part, I think, because of the economic collapse of 2008. People did not have other jobs to go to. People looked at their retirement portfolios, or as I call mine now, my 201k. This transfer is coming. And while for decades, people my age have said, where are we going to get young people who want long hours, bad pay, the lives of social and financial masochism with which my generation contented itself? In these meetings, we hear uniformly from young people, there are more than enough of us ready, willing, and poised to lead. The deal, though, is we don't want to be the custodians of that thing you made. If we don't have the same degree of power and autonomy to shape and change and mold those organizations that you had in creating them, well, then we're not interested. A perspective that means the real issue is not where do we find the heir apparent. The real issue we're facing is nonprofit capacity for flexibility and change, and that's an entirely different issue. Third, we heard about changes in audience composition and audience behavior. I assume we all know we are moving rapidly to being a non-majority country, as indeed California and Texas already are, to mention just two of our largest states. And while this shift promises fantastic new possibilities in aesthetics, new collaborations, new forms of cultural expression, and more, it challenges what we have assumed is an allegiance and understanding of traditional Eurocentric art forms and traditional Eurocentric social customs. Moreover, audiences are behaving in entirely new ways. Even when we started these conversations in 2006, 42% of men and 55% of women were saying, I am too tired to do the things I want to do. And the number one answer to what do you look forward to on a free night was not going to the theater or going to the museum or not even having dinner with friends. The number one answer is, I'm looking forward to a good night's sleep. Not surprisingly, after decades of growth, our audiences are dwindling. And our own financial needs, driven in many cases by rises in fixed cost, lumber's up, insurance facility is up, paper is up, health insurance is up. Those in tandem with negative trends in funding mean that we are escalating ticket prices in a way that's placing the arts outside of the reach of so many people in our communities we wish to reach and serve. And finally, and most germane to tonight, we heard about the yet-to-be-understood impact of technology on all of this writ large. Technology, as we hear it, in at least 4 dimensions. Number one, as competition. Leisure time internet consumption in this country has grown 50% in the last 3 years alone. The typical American is online for pleasure 29 hours every week. Just do the math. And by the time she graduates from college, a Skidmore senior will have spent 20,000 hours online and an additional 10,000 hours playing video games. A reminder, we now operate in a culture context where video games outsell movie and music recordings combined, and video games are reviewed in the arts and culture section of the New York Times. Technology is our biggest competitor for leisure time and attention, and it is kicking us to the curb. Issue number 2, technology is changing the way we consume. Thanks to the internet, we think we can get anything we want any time of day. We can shop at 4 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning. We can get jeans tailor-cut to our own body. FedEx or UPS has them on our doorstep the next morning. Internet assumptions of personalization, customization, and convenience that live arts, which have set curtain times, set venues, attendant inconvenience of travel and parking and the like, simply cannot meet. Third, it's changing donor behavior. Lest you think online charitable giving is not increasingly significant, I have 3 words to say to you. Ice Bucket Challenge. A campaign, a campaign that attracted more than $42 million from more than 700,000 new donors. The most visible sign of a movement that is annually becoming more and more a significant percentage of online contributions. At the same time, it encourages donors to think they can give small amounts to a wide swath of issues and solve the world's problems. It intermingles for-profit and nonprofit project causes. It sees the transaction as the starting point of a discussion rather than the fruits of a relationship. And it arguably teaches donors to prize novelty even while they don't have to understand anything about the charitable cause to which they're giving money. Trends that are going to have an enormous impact on how all of us are trying to raise money 20 years from now. And fourth and finally, it's changing cultural economics. We got to look at each other and say, what is it going to mean in 10 years when we say to a young person, that symphony, opera, or ballet ticket is $50, $75, $100, when that young person is used to downloading culture on demand 24/7 for $1.29 a song or for free. Museums alone are poised to ride this wave. Museums we can go to at 10 in the morning or 6 o'clock at night. Museums we can attend for relatively low prices. Museums essentially are a custom-made narrative determined by the visitor who makes the story based on how long she spends in front of a particular canvas or the order in which she goes from room to room to room. But for performing arts, these trends are deeply worrying and are seismic. And yet they're the same trends that are decimating newspapers and magazines. These are the same trends that spelled the end of Borders books and Tower records. And in performing arts groups, when you bring up the words of Adrienne Rich in the Common Language poem, when she says, we are out in a country that has no language, no laws, whatever we do is pure invention, the maps they gave us are out of date by years. People's heads nod in recognition. And aren't you glad you invited me here to brighten your day? As an occasional student, as an occasional student of history, I think that we can often learn from the past, and often the past illuminates the present in shocking ways. And I remember being at an ISPA conference in 2008 when somebody raised their hand and said, what if the moment we're facing is the equivalent of the religious reformation of the 15th century? What if we're in the arts reformation? I thought, boy, that's a fantastic question. If you know your history, you know that three things called the Reformation into practice. Number one, changes in technology. The printing press was invented. Suddenly anybody could have a Bible. You nailed a tract on a door in Germany. It could be mass reproduced and be all over the country in a matter of days or weeks. And God knows we are in the middle of a technological revolution and a massive redistribution of knowledge. Secondly, the religious Reformation obliterated the old business models. As a friend of mine who's a CEO has often said, the Reformation was a great time to be a land buyer and a rotten time to be a monastery. And on some level, we need to look at each other and say, is the symphony orchestra model today the monastery of the 21st century? But third, I think, and most profoundly, at its very heart, the Reformation called into question the need for intermediation. The Reformation asked, why do I need a priest to intercede for me with God? I should be able to talk to God directly. A question that is having a direct parallel today as more and more people are saying, why do I need a professional artist to have a creative or artistic experience? Just as the Reformation reframed old assumptions and broadened the idea of how religion would operate, where it would operate, with whom it would operate, giving rise to new denominations, new rituals, new things for clergy to do, new ways for the layperson to assume responsibility for his or her own spiritual destiny. We are witnessing an explosion of new practices and challenges to old assumptions. We're seeing the rise of what we call the hybrid artist, the avocational, untrained artist doing work at a professional level. You see their movies on YouTube, you see them in dance competitions and more at one end. And the rise of the professionally trained artist who works no longer in symphony halls or theaters or opera halls, not out of economic necessity, but because they believe the work they're called to do cannot be accomplished in a hermetic arts environment. These artists are transforming the cultural landscape. They're transforming our aesthetic vocabulary. But they're challenging the presumed ability of traditional cultural institutions and artists to set a cultural agenda. While our tendency in a time of change is to hear patterns as loss, this is a moment of expanding possibilities. You know, a man I really admire named Matt Locke of Story Things in the UK basically describes this change as moving from the age of broadcast to the age of circulation. The changing of time when it used to be a 30 or 60-minute unit that was disseminated once a week and tightly controlled by a network, to a time where the narrative framework has exploded. Instead of 30 minutes once a week, Netflix now releases all 13 episodes of House of Cards at one time. Some of you have done this. To encourage binge viewing, where you lock yourself in the apartment for a weekend and watch for 12 or 14 hours at a stretch, a very different model. Those of us old enough to remember The Wild Kingdom, which was Marlon Perkins with the tiger chasing the bounding antelope across the plain, and just as it would lunge, fangs bared, we would cut to the Mutual of Omaha commercial to spare us the carnage. Wild Kingdom has been replaced by the mini-cam in the bald eagle's nest, where people leave on their computer and drop in and out of will any time of day over an uninterrupted life event. We now operate in a context where the 24-hour Jerry Lewis telethon has been replaced by the viral charity thrust of the Ice Bucket Challenge. And it's not just the format that's changed. What this interaction means has changed. Alan Brown has written a seminal study called Getting In on the Act, where he says audience relations is now a 5-band spectrum. At the far left, you have the performance or the exhibition. It's why most of us went into this business, those of us who do this professionally, because we had a transforming encounter, whether that was listening to Beethoven or watching a swan on point flutter out from the wings, or whether it was going to the Monet exhibit, but the exhibit or the performance. Slightly to the right, you have what Alan calls the elaborated performance or exhibition. The performance accompanied by actor talkbacks, or program notes, or chances to socialize and meet the director afterwards. Essentially, ancillary materials or experiences that are designed to contextualize and enrich the performance or exhibit, but in which the power dynamic remains essentially unchanged. Artists produce, audiences consume. But then we cross a sort of bright line of sort where the audience begins to exercise a different degree of curatorial and interpretive control. We have first what he calls co-curated arts events, where the audience has an active say in the selection of the work to be produced. Some of you may know the Classical Theater of Harlem just 2 months ago did 5 staged readings and has asked the audience to vote on which of those 5 plays should be brought to full production. Many orchestras now give their audiences a choice of would you rather hear the Beethoven Ninth, the Fifth, or Carmina Burana, and determine their repertoire based on audience interaction. And the Denver Art Museum is famous for their First Persons Museum, a virtual space online where anyone can contribute an image meaningful to him or her, leading to a whole different, vibrant discussion about the value of the visual arts in a community far beyond the museum wall. Even one step further to the right, we find the co-created arts event, where the audience has an active role in making the work itself. The Liz Lerman Dance Exchange has been known for decades for going into a community and working with firemen and fishermen and electricians, not to teach them to dance, but to unlock the physical movement they already carry within them, and together to create a new dance that will be presented to their friends and community. Cornerstone Theater in LA for decades has led the way in helping groups not only do classical reinterpreted text, but in galvanizing new stories, a movement I found especially profound in 2002 when, in the wake of 9/11, they launched the Faith-Based Project, working with 10 different religious denominations to create short plays about the Abraham character, then presented in pairings around the city. So you saw the Muslim version presented with the Jewish version at the mosque, or you'd see the Baha'i version with the Catholic version at the temple, and on and on and on. Or, as in the symphonic field, the Rusty Musicians program at the Baltimore Symphony, where Marin Alsop every year holds auditions from people that grew up learning how to play the violin or piano, and then doubles the size of the orchestra, where the professionals play alongside the formerly trained, yet now lawyers, real estates, housewives, whatever, avocational musicians. As you can imagine, initially the professional musicians said, "Not on your life," when this idea happened. But now the professional musicians have found new inspiration, new dedication, new amazement in watching the discipline, the rigor, and the commitment of the people who play so arduously and well beside them. And fifth and finally, we have the surrender of space and resources. The flash mobs at the Museum of Santa Cruz, the surrender of the plaza to dozens of performances that happen concurrently during a formal performance inside the Yerba Buena Center in San Francisco, Or Donna Walker Kuhn's story in New York, where working with an immigrant community, what they found was people didn't want to come to the play. They wanted the stage to put their brothers and sisters and children on the stage with talent shows and community stories. A reminder that sometimes providing an environment where things can unfold uncontrolled by the artists can produce the most remarkable loyalty and allegiance of all. At every step we take to the right, the control the artist plays has to be let go. And indeed, Mark Bamuti Joseph of the Yerba Buena Center says, I don't even use the word audience anymore. I think of my work as intentional community design. And sometimes, yes, that community needs to be people dancing with me. Sometimes that community needs to be people at the other end of game consoles. Sometimes that group needs to be sitting in chairs watching me up on a stage. But thinking of community design as opposed to audience has unlocked for me an expanded sense of what is possible. Now, I'm the first to say this work isn't necessarily for everybody. But I think really forward-thinking organizations are asking themselves, where in these 5 bands can I find value? Where can I offer value? And how do I think about more fluidly moving back and forth across that spectrum as occasion and opportunity present themselves? You know, one group I've especially admired for thinking in bold new ways that seems especially apt for tonight is the Trey McIntyre Project that some of you may know. Trey McIntyre is a choreographer who had choreographed for Boston Ballet, Houston Ballet, San Francisco Ballet, among others. And in 2008, just in time for the national economy to collapse, he decided, I want my own full-time company. When he made the announcement, major donors in each of those 3 cities said, come to us. We will give you a building. We're going to write you a big check. And he said, no, I'm going to start my company in Boise, Idaho, a city of under 200,000 people, 550 miles from the next nearest urban center, and a city with no Arts Council funding and no history of dance. When they arrived, the project members initially attracted local attention not through billboards and flyers and mailings, but through spurbans, what they called spurbans, spontaneous urban events. If you were downtown Boise,